Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. We got quite an episode coming up, quite a cool conversation, a historical crime that's happened in basically our backyards here in Massachusetts. Super famous, super historical, and we have a return guest who we both really enjoy. Excellent storyteller and probably one of the best researchers that we have. He has a lot of details about this particular crime that you don't typically hear anywhere else. But Tim, I don't typically hear anywhere else how you're doing. How's your mood today?
You only ask me during these intros. I'm doing well. Thanks a lot. So we have Christopher Daley back here on Crawlspace, and he is a former teacher, Lance, and he does these live presentations around New England. And this conversation is focused on Lizzy Borden and the double murder of her parents. And of course, this happened in 1892 in Fall River, Massachusetts. We speak about we speak about the murders, and we speak about the trial and what happened afterwards. And it is a really interesting story.
The timing was really apropos here because we had just heard the verdict come down about Karen Reed. So it just felt like Lizzy Borden might have been the Karen Reed of her time. She had a big trial. She was acquitted. Lots of controversy, lots of support, lots of people who were anti-Lizzy Borden, who thought she was guilty. So the more things change, the more things stay the same. But Tim, something's going on in this audio, and it needs to be addressed.
Yeah, so there was a little bit of, I think, some kind of audio interference. It was on Christopher's end. And by the way, Christopher Daley's website is daileyhistory.com, D-A-L-E-Y. And you can check out his presentations there. But we listened back and heard this sound, and, I don't mean to make light of anything here, but I don't know. It's a little bizarre. I'm not sure where the interference comes from. What do you think?
I don't know either, but it was getting weirder and weirder the more this sound kept coming up, and how this sound would come up in connection with specific topics. It's like somebody is impersonating wind blowing with their mouth.
Okay, well, it's either a voice from the other side or the fan in Chris's laptop. I don't know.
Could have been the fan in his laptop. All I know is really want to get people's feedback on this. It's not distracting. It doesn't take away from anything. You just start to realize, like, what is that sound? He's talking about that guy who was eating peaches in the backyard again, and I'm hearing the sound again. It's interesting.
I don't know. I've listened to a lot of Coast to Coast, Lance, and once in a while when they covered paranormal topics, they would say that they had issues with the phones or just some electronic interference on those evenings. Not saying that's what happened here. I don't know. But I hope you enjoy the episode either way.
Yep. I just, felt we needed to give listeners a heads up so we can get some feedback. Even if your theory is like, you guys are overblowing this whole thing, that's a audio interference that's very common. Yeah, that's probably the case. Feel free to let us know.
All right, everyone. Well, please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. We're going to break quick for commercial, and we'll be right back with Christopher Daley.
And the ghost of Lizzy Borden. And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome back to the podcast, Christopher Daley. Chris, how are you today?
I'm doing great, thank you. How are you?
Well, we are doing great as well, and doing even better now that you're back on the show. When you had wrapped up your conversation with us a few weeks ago about Franklin Evans, I'll say the country's first serial killer.
Probably New England's first serial killer, I would say.
New England's first, okay.
Yeah.
So once we wrapped up that conversation, we immediately were like, we got to get this guy back on. So welcome back on. And can you remind the viewers and listeners who you are and what your specialty is?
I was a teacher for 25 years. I taught at Silver Lake Regional Middle School in Kingston, Massachusetts. And I also had a little sideline where I would do historical talks around New England. I've been doing this, I think, close to 30 years. And one of the first talks that I developed was the Lizzy Borden case. And I've been doing that for years and years and years. And I've added a lot of other talks to my repertoire. And also, a few years back, I wrote a book called Murder and Mayhem in Boston, which touches on some very interesting murder cases, maybe that you didn't hear of. But at the time, they were extremely popular or very controversial. I'm up in New Hampshire now, soon to be Florida. Hopefully, I can continue doing my lecture business as we were just talking about.
You know what they say, Florida is the New Hampshire of the South.
Yes. A lot of retirees are down there, I hear. Yeah. And I'm just sick of the it's not the cold, it's the snow and the ice and driving in it. And I will not miss that at all.
So where did your interest in Lizzy Borden's case come from?
I'm kind of dating myself here. Back in the 70s, I saw a movie called The Legend of Lizzy Borden with Elizabeth Montgomery. And I just thought it was enthralling. And initially when I saw it, I thought, wow, this Fall River, where is this? I was probably in middle school or something. And I thought it was in California because actually the movie was shot in California. Then I found out Fall River was right in my own backyard. Fall River is maybe 20, 30 miles from where I grew up in Pembroke, Massachusetts. And as I got older, I got more interested in it and read about it more and more. And it's really a mystery. Lizzy was acquitted. A lot of people think from the little ditty, Lizzy Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks, that she was guilty. She was found not guilty. It's still a mystery as to what happened. If you study the case, trying to figure out what actually happened, I call it America's Jack the Ripper case. There's a Bordenologists out there, just like Ripperologists. But that's how it all started. I was old enough to get some wheels. I went down there and found out, geez, the house is still there. And I took pictures of it. Years later, it was a private residence back then. Years later, they turned the house into a bed and breakfast, and it still is today. And you can access it, stay the night. I will not stay the night. It's a creepy place. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's said to be one of the most haunted places in New England as well. That's a whole other story. That's how I got interested.
Very cool. Now, why won't you stay the night?
I'm not sensitive or anything. One of these people that feels or sees spirits. The place is creepy. And when you go in, I try to say to myself, well, you know what happened here, 2 double homicides, so your brain's playing tricks on you. But you go into the place and like the hair in the back of your neck stands up and you get chills. And there's different spots in the house where I had like trouble breathing. It wasn't like I just went up a flight of stairs or anything. And there's been many, many stories of encounters, if you will. That's a whole other dimension of the Lizzy Borden case.
Okay, it didn't occur to me until right now, and I guess it wouldn't have occurred to me until yesterday anyway, that Lizzy Borden might be in the same conversation now as Karen Read.
Yes, definitely.
The Karen Read of her time.
Definitely. She was acquitted. There was no mistrial or anything. The problem with the Lizzy Borden case was there really wasn't any physical evidence. And although she was the only person in the house during at least one of the murders, she didn't have any blood on her, not in her hair, on her dress, nothing. But there was blood splattered all over the place. The pathologist who testified said that the murderer would have been covered from head to toe in blood and gore. And moments after the murder, she didn't have any blood on her. The hatchet that the prosecution had turned out to have blood on it. However, when it was sent into the analyst, Dr. Wood at Harvard, kind of the CSI of the time, he was able to determine it wasn't human blood, it was animal blood. So that weapon couldn't have been the murder weapon.
Can we take it back to Lizzy Borden, her family life before the murders? Set the scene for us.
First of all, it wasn't her mother that was hatcheted, it was her stepmother. Her mother, Sarah Morse Borden, died when she was about 2 or 3. And her sister Emma, who was older than her, kind of took on the motherly aspect. They had a really tight relationship, sister-mother type of relationship. A few years later, Abby, her stepmother, married her father, Andrew. Now, to talk about Andrew started off kind of on the wrong side of the tracks. although his family, the Bordens, were the founding family of Fall River, and most of them were extremely wealthy. They lived on what they called the hill, where all the mansions were. His family ended up on kind of in the poor side. His father was a fishmonger. That's somebody that just goes around selling fish on the side of the road. And I think he knew that his cousins were up there living in grandeur, and he just had this drive to become rich. Started out as a carpenter, invested his money, and by the time he died, he had interest in the textile mills, the banks, and was worth $500,000, which translated today would be about $17 to $18 million. However, part of the reason he got there was that he was extremely cheap. They lived at 92 2nd Street, which was really a tenement building that he converted into a one-family house. They didn't have any electricity at the time, 1892. They had electricity, no indoor plumbing. They had a latrine in the basement. They didn't even have gas jets for lighting. They lit the place by whale oil. And he was like this button-down old Yankee. Now, the daughters knew as well that they had these cousins up on the hill and they had great wealth. And they wanted that. They knew their father had that wealth. And I think that bothered them to a great degree. They get this little allowance every year. That seems to be a source of agitation within the house. And then there comes a period where the mother, Abby, her sister, Sarah Whitehead, her husband died, and she's living in a house with a mortgage. And Andrew and Abby got together kind of on the down low, kind of secretly, and paid that mortgage. Then when the daughters found out about it, they were absolutely irate because they're living in basically squalor. And here he goes and gives all this money to Abby's sister. And there we see some kind of break where the daughters start referring to her as Mrs. Borden and not Mother or Abby anymore. There's this tension in the house. We know that that is leading up to the murders, to the double homicide. The dynamics in that house are very, very interesting leading up to that. And there's also, I should mention, there's somebody else in the house. That's Bridget, the maid. They had a maid who the two sisters called Maggie, oddly enough, because the previous maid's name was Maggie, which you might think, oh, wow, how callous is that? And I used to think that too until I came across the fact that that was like a general name for an Irish maid back then. So it's not so bad. The two older folks in the house referred to her as Bridget. So she's in the house. Lizzy is in the house. Her sister Emma, however, is not in the house during the murder. She's off visiting friends. And that was kind of odd because she was a real homebody and didn't really go out visiting much. But that particular week, she was off in Fairhaven visiting relatives, I should say, actually. So those people are the ones that are in the house. Also, there's another character, John Vinicum Morse, who is Lizzy's biological uncle, Sarah's brother, lived out in Iowa for years and years and years. And then about a year earlier, he decides to move back into the area. He spent the previous night in the guest room of the Borden house. He showed up, had a chat with Andrew in the parlor, and spent the night. So he was there during the morning, but left to visit relatives. So when the murders happened, he wasn't really there. It was just basically Lizzy, Bridget, and the two parents in the house. So I hope that sets the scene.
That absolutely sets the scene. What are the age ranges? How old are the parents? How old is Lizzy?
Andrew was 72. Abby, I believe, was early 60s, 65, 63. Not coming to my mind immediately. Lizzy was 32. She was considered to be what they called a spinster back then, somebody who wasn't married. If you weren't married off by your early 20s, you're an old maid, a spinster. The same goes for Emma. She was in her late 30s, approaching 40. She was just this kind of homebody that never courted anybody, never dated. Lizzy did have somewhat of a social life. She did date various men, but the literature, if you read about it, the saying was that old man Borden always scared him off. So thereby, she remained a spinster. So you have the two older sisters living at home. During those times, there wasn't really much opportunity, employment for women in that status. They could be teachers, maybe. Their destiny was to either get married or be an old maid. And that's kind of what happened. Abby was in her 30s when she married Andrew. And the talk around town was that it was a marriage of convenience because he needed a wife. She needed to get out of spinsterhood. He needed a wife to take care of the kids, and she needed somebody to take care of her. So that's the tenor of the times, really. There wasn't much opportunity for women in that station. In the lower classes in Fall River, it was different. The women would be working in the mills, maids like Bridget. But although they lived in this ramshackle old house, they were still seen as like upper middle class.
You mentioned the mills, and we've talked about Fall River. What was
Right.
that area like back in the late 1800s when all of this was happening?
Yeah, it was booming. It was loaded with textile mills. It was pretty diverse. You had Irish, you had Portuguese in there. You had a lot of old Yankee families in there. And it was usually the Yankee families that owned the mills, and you had the newly arrived immigrants working in those mills. And it was a very productive time, the Industrial Revolution. And these mills are still there. If you go into Fall River, they're still there. I think there's one or two still operating, to tell you the truth, but most are apartment buildings now. They're beautiful old buildings. If you've ever been to Lowell or Lawrence, the same thing. It was a bustling city.
You've set the scene for us. We know the characters. Now, what happened on the day of the murders?
That was August 4th, 1892. It was pretty hot. It was in the 80s. And the first one up was Bridget. She came down to prepare the meal. If you look at what they were eating, it was mutton and broth and Johnny cakes. And the mutton and broth they had been eating for about 4 days running. And I don't even think they had an icebox back then. The thing is, later on, Lizzy would say that she thought somebody was trying to poison the family. And during the autopsy, they actually tested for poison. I think they were poisoning themselves with rancid meat. And it's another example of Andrew's, his frugality, if you will. They had been sick for a few days running. After Bridget came down, Andrew and Abby came down, and they were joined by John Vinicum Morse, who I mentioned stayed over that night. They had breakfast. They talked about what they were going to do that day. John Vinicum Morse said he was going to go over to visit the Emery family. They were relatives, and they were over on Waybosset Street in Fall River. Andrew, who's still not feeling well, said he was going to make a stab at going and doing his rounds and visiting the bank and checking in at some of the mills. And also, he had just had a pretty big building built called the Andrew J. Borden Building, which he was about to open. The carpenters were there doing the finishing work, and he was going to go over and check on that. Lizzy, by the way, was in the house. She did not come down. She had been out the night before when John Vinicum Morse came in. He was sitting in the parlor talking to Andrew, and she just ran upstairs. She didn't have any contact at all with John Vinicum Morse, which I've always thought was kind of funny. It's like they avoided talking to each other. And I'll tell you why later on when we start talking about who could have done this. Then John was the first one out. He went down to the Emerys. Andrew, he went out. By the way, John was told by Andrew, he was asked, I should say, are you going to come back for dinner? And in New England, dinner was the lunch meal. So he's expected to come back by noon. And Andrew, as I say, went out. He tried to stop in. I think he stopped in at the bank, checked on the building that he was having built. And then he went over to Pierre Leduc's barbershop, had himself a shave. He got a shave every day down at Pierre Leduc's. I think he decided to call it quits for the day. This is 10:30, 11 o'clock, and decides to go back up to the house, not feeling too well. Now, the funny thing is when he approaches the house, he tries to enter through the side, and he finds the side door is latched. It's one of those screen doors with a little latch. He's a little frustrated at that. And he goes around to the front, and the front door is locked too, oddly. So he fumbles with his keys, gets his keys out, and he's still having trouble. The door will not open. His frustration is really overtaking him at this point. He starts banging on the door. And Bridget, who is told to wash the windows inside and out earlier that morning, is washing windows and hears him banging on the door. And she comes and she starts to try to open the door, and the latch just won't release. And later in the hearing, she said, "I said pshaw," which is kind of like somebody saying, "Oh, darn." Being Irish myself, I think she said something a lot stronger because at that point, she heard somebody giggling on the landing above her in the foyer. And it was Lizzy. Lizzy was standing on the landing, very entertained at her trying to get the door open and saying pshaw. Finally, Andrew is able to come in, and he's not in a good mood. He slams the keys on the mantle, and Lizzy descends the steps and asks, "Has there been any mail?" And he gruffly says, "No, there hasn't been any mail," and goes into the parlor, or the sitting room, I should say. Now, at this point, Lizzy follows him in. And according to her inquest testimony, she helped him get settled on the lounge or the couch. She gave him a Providence journal. She said she helped him take off his shoes and said dinner will be ready in a little while. So he's in the sitting room. And then Lizzy approached Bridget in the dining room and said, "Hey, there's a great sale of dress goods at Sargent's. Why don't you go get you some?" And Bridget, by this time, was exhausted from washing the windows and everything. And she just said, "Oh, Miss Lizzy, can I go up and take a nap?" And her room, if you ever go to the Borden house, is like in the attic. And this is 80 degrees, and you know what an attic's like. So she went up to take a nap. And from this point on, all we know what happened was from Lizzie's inquest testimony. She said at this point, she left the house and went into the barn, went into the loft. She claimed that she was looking for lead to make sinkers because she was going fishing with some friends of hers in a few days in Marion, a few towns over. And while she was in there, she said, "Oh, I had a few pears." They had a pear tree out back, which got some good use that day. She then said she heard a moaning coming from the house. And she went into the house, discovered Andrew had been horribly butchered. Right there on the couch. I don't know if you've seen the pictures. He's there in kind of a leaning position as if somebody just clocked him. And immediately she calls up to Bridget. Bridget, come down. And Bridget rushes down. And the first thing Lizzy says is to go get Dr. Bowen, who lives across the street. And Bridget rushes across the street to Dr. Bowen's house. He's not there. He's on a house call. She rushes back in, and Lizzy says, "Go get Alice Russell." Alice Russell's her best friend who lives down the street. And then Bridget goes sprinting down the street. So in the meantime, one of her neighbors, Mrs. Churchill, is coming up the street, and she sees all of this. And she goes to the side door, and Lizzy is just standing against the screen, staring off into the distance. And Mrs. Churchill says, "Oh, Lizzy, whatever is wrong?" And Lizzy, in a monotone voice, just said, "Oh, Mrs. Churchill, do come in. Somebody's murdered father." And Mrs. Churchill is led into the house, and she later said she almost got sick at the sight.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Now, if we were to look at that crime scene photograph, Andrew's head was like applesauce. It's very blurry. Luckily for us, they didn't have HD photography back then. His face was brutally butchered. His eyeball was resting on his cheek. There was blood splattered all over the wall. It said that he received about 10 to 12 blows to the head, not 40. Later on, as I said, the pathologist said that the murderer would have been covered head to toe. Finally, word gets out to Dr. Bowen, and he arrives. This is shortly after 11 o'clock in the morning. And he takes a look at the body, and he would later remark that he hadn't seen anything that gruesome since Shiloh. He was a Civil War surgeon. And at this point, everybody is standing around looking at the body. And then Dr. Bowen says, "Lizzy, where's your mother?" And Lizzy says, "Oh, she received a note from a friend to go visit her. She's sick. But I think I heard the cellar door open and shut. She might be in the house." Now, this is very interesting because no note was ever found. No sick friend was ever found. So this was a lie. She made this up. Abby didn't go anywhere. So they decided to search the house. And they found Abby up in the guest room on the floor. It seems that she was tucking the sheets in. She was helping make the bed. And somebody came in from the doorway and it was a blitz attack. One glancing blow to the side of the head. She went down on her stomach. And the doctors would later say whoever did this stood astride her with a hatchet and just hit down, possibly about 18 times into the back of the head. So they found her body. They've got the father's body. The police have to be called. The thing is, the police were on a picnic in Rocky Point, and there was only one officer available, Officer Allen. So he came in, saw the scene, put a man by the name of Charles Sawyer on the door as a guard, and he ran back to tell Marshal Hilliard that there's been a double homicide. In the meantime, a crowd starts to gather all around the house. And this is when John Vinegar Morse arrives. Now, John Vinegar Morse has an interesting story. He said that he took a trolley back, came up 2nd Street, walked into the backyard and had a few pears for himself. And then he went into the house and noticed that there was a double homicide. There's a couple problems with that. There were about 30 people milling around. Charles Sawyer was at the door with Bridget, and he would later testify that John Vinegar Morse walked through that crowd of people, stood in the backyard and had a pear. Odd behavior. And then discovers that there's been a double homicide. So that he has some very strange behavior here too. What happens is the police are all called in. They arrive, and this is not your modern day police department. They don't have really good crime scene investigation techniques back then. Their job was usually to break up domestic disputes, haul drunks off to the drunk tank, and they started to search the house. They questioned Lizzy. She didn't have a drop of blood on her. She did, however, make a funny remark, though. They said, "Who do you think could have done this to your mother?" And she said, "She's not my mother. She's my stepmother." Odd thing to say at this juncture. But they searched the house. They found what they thought was some evidence. They found this hatchet that was down in the basement in a box in a little cubby hole. And they took it out. It looked like somebody had dumped some ashes from the stove on it. And they found a handleless hatchet. And they said it was a fresh break. And the hatchet appeared to have blood on it and hair. And as I said, it was blood and hair, but later discovered to be animal. They bagged it, tagged it, and sent it to Professor Wood, the CSI of the time. At this point, they started going throughout the house and looking for more evidence. Seeing that Lizzy didn't have any blood on her, they thought, well, maybe we should search her hamper, her clothing. They did find a dress that did have a minute pinprick dot of blood up on the inside of the skirt. So they took that in as evidence too. The coroner arrived, and I find this ghastly. They brought in autopsy tables and put the two bodies on the autopsy tables in the sitting room and took the stomachs out right there. Now you might be like, why the stomachs? Because Lizzy had been saying that there had been poisoning. So they removed the stomachs and sent those to Dr. Wood for chemical analysis. At this point, at the end of the day, police left, and this is another thing. They put a sheet on the dining room table and put the bodies on the dining room table and left them there. Emma had just returned. She got news. John Morse spent the night in the house with the two bodies on the table. Bridget was frightened out of her mind, and she left, and she stayed with friends that night. But there was a police guard put on the house, and they noticed in the middle of the night that a lantern lit upstairs where the bedrooms were, and somebody came down the stairs and went into the dining room and just stood over the bodies for a pretty long time. Was that Lizzy, Emma? Was it all of them? Who knows? But those three spent the night in the house with the bodies. And then the next morning, John Vinica Morse noticed that there was bloody clothing still left by the police. And he does another strange thing here. He hires a boy, pays him $5 to bury the clothes in the backyard. When the police arrived to re-examine the crime scene, they asked him where the clothes were. And he was like, I buried them in the backyard. They're like, what are you doing? That's evidence. Go dig it up. Get it back. Anyway, eventually they removed the bodies. They brought them to the Oak Grove Cemetery into a holding crypt. And they did something else here, which a lot of people don't know about. They removed the heads, boiled the flesh off of the heads, and they made plaster casts of the skulls. The thinking was, we're going to bring these plaster casts into the court and try to fit that hatchet into the wounds, which they did later in the trial. So Lizzy, as she was questioned, John Vinica Morse initially was looked at as the suspect, but he had an airtight alibi, and Lizzy became the suspect. The mayor actually came on the 7th of August just for a chat, and she immediately said, Mr. Mayor, am I a suspect? And he said, yeah, you are. And she walked over and she put her hands up and said, put the cuffs on. And this is the 19th century. Women aren't that forward, you know. And he said, oh, well, just don't leave town. And then the next step was to have a coroner's inquest where a judge, they had a coroner's jury where they all listened to everything and they made the determination of cause of death, blunt force trauma, obviously. But they interviewed everybody. Lizzy actually was called and questioned, and she made several inconsistent statements about where she was during certain times. She said that she helped him get his Congress boots off, as I already mentioned. If you look at the crime scene photograph, he's got his boots on. How they got back on his feet, I don't know. Some people say that before they took the photograph, it was just common courtesy to put those boots back on before they took the photograph. I don't know if that happened or not. That's some people speculate about that. She tripped up, the prosecutor, Hosea Knowlton, tripped her up a few times on where she was during certain times. But it should be noted that she was on some kind of sedative at the time, and she later claimed that it was muddling her mind. From the coroner's inquest, she was handed over to the grand jury. And at the coroner's inquest, Judge Blaisdell actually said, Lizzy, I believe you're probably guilty. And all that information was taken to the grand jury. And at the time, the grand jury had finished its session, but it reconvened because Alice Russell, who was her friend, had a guilty conscience. She came forward and she said a few days after the murder, she was sitting in the kitchen with Lizzy and Emma, police guard on the door, and Lizzy went up into the cupboard and grabbed what looked like a dress and put it into the fire. They had a fireplace back then, a cook stove. And Mrs. Russell said, Lizzy, that's probably the worst thing you could have ever done. And Lizzy, in shock, said, oh, why did you say something? She testified to that, and I think that was just the final nail in the coffin. So they indicted Lizzy on 3 counts of murder, 1 for the mother, 1 for the father, and 1 for both of them. I guess they wanted to make it stick. And she spent the better part of the year in Taunton jail awaiting the trial, which took place the next year. And it was held in New Bedford Superior Court. So that's the murder. And then you have the trial. That's a whole other bowl of wax, too.
That is fantastic. So many things that I didn't know about Lizzy Borden, and I'm sure a lot of listeners didn't know about Lizzy Borden and the murders. But I want to back up just a little bit and just maybe review one thing that I don't want to have slip by. You said something about this was a lie that Lizzy Borden said about her stepmom. Can you just emphasize that a little bit? Because that was really interesting.
When they asked Lizzy, they said, "Is your mother in the house?" She said, "Oh, she got a note from a friend to go visit her because the friend was sick." She thought that she was trying to indicate that Abby had been out of the house. And this was, there was never any note found. There was no friend that nobody came forward and said, "Oh, I was that friend," that said that she had been visiting. So that is right there. I mean, they call that consciousness of guilt. She lied. I don't know what forever reason to try to delay finding Abby or what. That was found to be totally false. Why she lied.
Interesting.
Another thing is, I mentioned that Bridget was having trouble with the locks. And if you go to the Borden house and you stand in the position where Lizzy was, she was directly across from the guest room where Abby's body was. Now, it was later found, Dr. Wood determined that Abby died an hour and a half before Andrew did, simply because they ate at the same time and the digestion showed that her digestion wasn't advanced as his. So we know that she was up there when Lizzy was up there, either giggling at Bridget or looking over and giggling at the mother. Some people have speculated she was looking at the mother.
Wow, really interesting. And then what was Sister Emma's behavior like after the murders?
Quiet as usual. She got news, she came back, and she was always by Lizzy's side. She always supported Lizzy until the day she moved out after the murders. I'll tell you about that a little bit later, too. Yeah, so she was Lizzy's staunch supporter. Still kind of the mother-sister role there. You know, she was the buffer against everybody else, yeah.
Do you think that she had an idea that the murders were going to happen?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. People have speculated or said that she rarely ever left the house. And on this particular time, she was out of the house like something was going to happen.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
You also said that they had cut the heads off, boiled the skin off, made the plaster cast.
Yeah.
And you said that they actually were able to match the wounds in the skull with the hatchet that they found?
It was about 3.5 inches, and it did fit in some of the wounds, but the biological evidence precluded that it couldn't have been the murder weapon. It was a hatchet, I think. Back in 1992, there was a big discovery. In the records, they found out that in one of the skulls, they found something called glint, which is like a new finish. When you buy a hatchet, it had like a new shiny finish on it. So they were able to determine that the weapon that was used was a brand new hatchet. And the one that was submitted was not a brand new hatchet. I should say about a year later, the next door neighbor was tearing down his barn, and they found a roofing hatchet on top of the barn. I've always thought that that was probably the weapon, and whoever did it just threw it up on the roof there. And, you know, at the time, I tried to follow it in the papers. Back then, when I first was researching, you didn't have the internet. It was all microfilm and everything. And I followed it. They speculated that maybe this was the weapon, and then it just disappears, you know? So it probably was a hatchet, just not that hatchet.
I'm so impressed. You're good. How did you find that piece of information? That's really incredible.
Something I love in research is just going through the old newspapers. There was just this news article that came out about a year after. I don't know how I got onto it, but I found it, and I just tried to follow it. And it was in the paper for a few days. What's this hatchet? Maybe this is the real hatchet. And then, boom, it's gone. And nobody knows where that hatchet is. And it probably had succumbed to the weather, was rusty. And that may have been the actual hatchet that was used.
Wow, because, yeah, otherwise the murder weapon was never found.
Right. The one that they have at the Fall River Historical Society is not the murder weapon. They didn't have DNA back then, but they could tell by the corpuscles whether it was human blood or animal blood. It was said to be blood of a cow. That's what the doctor testified to.
Was there any evidence or any sightings of Lizzy buying hatchet or doing anything strange like that?
Yeah, I'll tell you. And it wasn't introduced in the court. A druggist by the name of Eli Bent said the day before the murder, Lizzy came to his drugstore and tried to purchase something called prussic acid, which is an extremely deadly poison. And she said she needed to fumigate a sealskin cape. I guess moths were in it. And he said, "Madam, I can't sell you that without a prescription. It's a highly toxic, deadly poison." And she argued with him. Now, I always, to my audiences, I point out that prussic acid is the main ingredient in Zyklon B. You know what that is? That's what they dropped in the showers in Auschwitz. We have that, but when Eli Bentz was ready to testify at the trial, they ruled that he couldn't testify because there was no evidence of poisoning, which I find fantastic. I think it goes to motive that she tried to buy poison before the actual murder happened. And if you look in the annals of crime, when women do kill, at least in the 19th century, a lot of the times it was by poison.
We recently had a guest on who went through all of the different types of poisons. She's a professor at MIT, and she's an expert in poisons, and she was talking to us about how it was the poison of choice for certain people in certain time periods. And I think arsenic was called the inheritance poison.
Yes.
Yeah, which I thought was super cool in a really dark way.
And I think they tested for arsenic, and there was no arsenic. So I don't know if they had been sick, but going back to the mutton and broth, I think it was just eating bad food and Lizzy had been sick too. So I don't think she would have dosed herself.
Well, Tim's been eating mutton and broth for like 6 months right now. This should probably be a bit of a warning for you, Tim, to slow down on the mutton and broth.
Stay away from the mutton and broth, Tim.
Well, what about the trial? Can we talk about the trial now?
The trial was like the trial of the century. Everybody was there. The thinking back then was, how could such a small woman commit such a heinous crime? And it just drew the attention of so many people. It started off, the prosecution made its case, and it fell apart pretty quickly because Dr. Wood took the stand and he's like, nope, it's not the murder weapon that you're claiming it to be. Didn't have any human blood on it, but they got up in the trial. This was like a highlight of the trial. One of the doctors took one of those plaster casts of the skulls in the trial and tried to jam the hatchet in, and Lizzy swooned in the court. They didn't remove her. They didn't even think this is the family. Maybe they shouldn't be in the court when they're thinking like scientists, and crime scene investigators, not as humans. I think all the sympathy went to her at that point. But even though they knew that that was not the murder weapon, the biological evidence didn't support it. They're up there trying to jam the thing in there. And the blood on the dress, Dr. Wood brought that up, and he said, he got really flustered. He said, this blood, Miss Lizzy had fleas. And that was a euphemism for the time that it was her own menstrual blood. So that was out the window, and he tested for poison. There was no evidence of poison. So what they had to go on was just innuendo that the girls wanted to get the inheritance and that he had a will that he was going to cut them out of the inheritance, which no will was ever produced. The only thing that they could hang their hat on was when people were at the crime scene, there was a scroll of paper burning in the stove. That must have been the will. We don't know. There was never a lawyer that came forward and said, oh, yes, I was helping with a will. And so the prosecution case was extremely weak. And all the defense had to do is come in and just introduce reasonable doubt. There were all sorts of strange people in the neighborhood during that time. There were carriages that were spotted outside the house. All these different factors led to reasonable doubt, and she was acquitted. And they did not introduce Eli Bentz. I think that might have turned the tide a little bit because that really goes to motive.
Now, was there cheers or applause when she
Yeah.
was found not guilty? Yeah.
Oh yeah. People, and she fell down and just started crying. The reporters ran out to wire the story around the world that Lizzy Borden had been acquitted. And then she was acquitted. And then the after trial was very interesting too, because she was acquitted in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion, no. The first inkling was when she went to church and there was about a 30-foot circumference around her of empty pews. Nobody would sit next to her. Her friends stopped calling. When she'd go into town, they'd see her and walk the other way or be like talking behind her back. So she became somewhat of a recluse. Now, in the years following, she sold the house and bought a big mansion up on the hill that she called Maplecroft. So she and her sister, who lived there with her, did benefit. They inherited all that money. So if you say follow the money, they inherited it. And another thing is John Vinegar Morse just went back to Iowa after that. Bridget, it said, went to Ireland for a short time and then came back and married. Her name was Bridget Sullivan. She married a fellow named Sullivan, and they moved out to the Midwest. The thinking is that she never received any payment, but they didn't have credit cards back then. Didn't you get cash in hand? How's anybody to know that? And she stayed as this recluse. I should mention another thing. Around the turn of the century, she and Emma had a falling out, and Emma moved to Newmarket, New Hampshire. She left Lizzy. And what I think it was over was Lizzy got very involved with theater people in New York City. She loved to go to Broadway and everything. And she started bringing these people to the house and having these wild parties. And one of them, Nance O'Neill, ended up moving in with Lizzy. The talk about that was that they were lovers. Nance O'Neill later on, and this is pretty interesting, in those times was an avowed lesbian. So they had, for a short time, she was living with Lizzy and then she left. And it's about that same time that Emma left Lizzy. And a newspaper reporter interviewed Emma years later and she said, "Oh, there's something horrible that happened and I'll never talk about it." And that's probably what it was. And Lizzy died, I think, at the age of 62 of congestive heart failure. And 9 days later, Emma died in a hospital of complications. I forget what it was. It was just normal, sickness.
Emma said there's something terrible, and the theory is that the something terrible was that Lizzy was having a lesbian relationship.
Right.
Why would she be so vague when her parents were both like brutally murdered? Why would she just leave that open-ended? Why wouldn't she just say, "Oh, and by the way, I'm not talking about the double murder"?
You can read that another way. Maybe she found out that Lizzy did do it, and that was the terrible thing.
Okay.
We don't know. I've seen another historian said that Lizzy was having these parties and they were drinking alcohol. And the Borden family were all teetotalers. So maybe that was it. I don't think.
But not the double murder.
That's a horrible thing. Yeah, the double murder, right. Maybe it was because she was Lizzy's staunch supporter. Maybe Lizzy came out and said, "Hey, I did do it." Who knows?
So they both benefited from the murders financially, but
Yes.
Lizzy stayed.
In Fall River.
Even before you told us all of these details that we didn't know, I was always so fascinated by the fact that Lizzy Borden stayed in this city, small city.
Yes.
For the most part, there's just a couple of industries going on there. I guess she did her best to be a recluse, but she became a recluse by buying a mansion on a hill.
Right, in Fall River.
Why didn't she move to New York where she could hang out with the Broadway folks?
Interesting that you mentioned that because I found a quote of hers and she said, when it comes out what really happened, all those people who have been, I forget the exact word, but the essence is dogging me and saying I'm guilty. When they find out the truth, they'll feel sorry. So it's almost as if there's this righteousness. I'm innocent and wrongly accused of this by all these people, and I'm going to stay right here to prove them wrong, which nothing ever came out to really prove that she did it or didn't do it. You think she'd move to California and get away from all that? because she was still under the scrutiny. Every year there'd be something in the newspaper about the Borden case. A book came out by a man by Edmund Pearson about the case, and it said that Lizzy bought up the edition and had the books destroyed. So, she had to live under this light, the spotlight, for the rest of her life. And she didn't move. That's a good question. I think I'd take off and go to the Bahamas or something.
Yeah, definitely get out of that town, because it kind of feels like she's imprisoned a little bit by, the rumors and the local gossip and things like that, even though she's technically free, Very strange. My gosh.
The kids in the neighborhood used to challenge each other to go up and touch the house and run back. It was like the evil lady in the big mansion there,
And that was her new house?
That was the new one. She left that after a few years. This is where the Lizzy Borden took an axe thing started. The kids were jumping rope outside the house and came up with that. Yeah, it's called Maplecroft. It's still there. They've been trying to open that up as a bed and breakfast, but the city has kind of put the kibosh on that. I was lucky enough, I was called by the show Kindred Spirits, and they had done the Lizzy Borden house, and they wanted me to tell them about the Maplecroft. So I was on the show, and I said, you know what? If I was Lizzy, I wouldn't be down at 2nd Street. I wouldn't be haunted that place with all those Ouija boards and everything. And I said, first of all, when you're talking to her, don't call her Lizzy, because she changed her name to Lisbeth. So when they went into Maplecroft, before I talked to them, they were calling her Lizzy. They didn't get anything. And then they started calling her Lisbeth, and all these things started happening at Maplecroft, which was kind of interesting.
Bold, very bold.
So she's not at 2nd Street. She's at Maplecroft, folks.
Would this be in bad taste? Because I've been workshopping a new business idea. What if the three of us opened a axe throwing facility and called it 40 Wax?
That's kind of, it's getting there with the kitsch. They've got rubber, I think last time I checked, they had like rubber hatchets for sale at the Lizzy Borden house. The folks over there are not going to like me, but I think it's disrespectful to be having seances there every night.
I agree.
And they do reenactments in that house. And we forget, this isn't a game of Clue. We forget there were human beings that were murdered there. And to do this, I think it's extremely disrespectful.
Yeah, that's incredible. Wow. Well, Chris, thank you so much for spending some time with us today and telling us about this story.
Thanks. It's fun.
Yeah, well, we really appreciate it. It's quite a wild story, kind of dark and a bit mysterious too.
She's one of those names that you really need someone like you to come on and say, here are the details that aren't typically spoken about. Some of them are more gruesome, too. Some of them are far more gruesome than you get. And I think that's important. I think it's important to take the conversation away from the children's rhyme that's out there, and that's all that people really know. All of those details have really made the texture of this story that much better. The story is a great crime story in New England. So, yeah, thank you so much for presenting
Still unsolved. Yes, thank you.
Still unsolved. Will never be solved, right?
She was guilty.
Yeah, I get that. After I do my talk, so you have a great debate, I always say, maybe we'll solve it tonight, huh? And everybody's got a theory. There's every year there's a new book, with a new theory and everything. So it is. It's America's Jack the Ripper case.
Now, well, Jack the Ripper / Karen Reed.
Yeah. All right, Karen Reed. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Chris. This was another great conversation. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.